Hello,
Got
Bill.
it. Hi, Sandy.
Well, after technical difficulties, we're finally recording, and I'm really pleased to be speaking this evening about Rothko, which is why I've called it Code Red, because I think Rothko is synonymous with the color red, maybe more than any other color. What do you think?
You mean Joseph Rothko, or his brother Timothy?
What?
Oh, you mean the famous Rothko?
The famous one.
Yeah.
The famous one. Fellow New Yorker, really.
Well, all the great artists of the mid 20th century were New Yorkers to a large extent.
Well, actually, yes, and they not necessarily, but yes, there were so many who were living and working in the middle of last century.
It's in the same way that all the great artists were Parisian in the 1890s. It's the same kind of thing.
Say that again now.
I mean, I wouldn't say anything like that. They were all Scottish
Of
the
course,
whole time.
of course. Anyway, speaking of seeing Code Red, I think the phrase Code Red actually is about some kind of alarm. And I do wonder with Rothko's paintings where some people perceive there to be a real quality of like a depth of quiet, others see an incredible disturbance. There's almost like an alarm in them, something primal. Anyway, I think for a lot of people, there'll be a realization that Rothko.
Wait, quick, 1 second. Do you find them settling or unsettling?
I think it depends.
The famous stuff that we're talking about, like the later stuff that we all know.
Yeah, I think it depends on how the images are consumed. So, for example, in Tate Modern, I can go there. I can go and sit in the Rothko room, and I can take in their almost like their energy. Energetically, they can communicate within that great grey space, and all the paintings are on the wall. And it's a very, very quiet room in that perhaps it's reverential rather than peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
When I view Rothko's work on screen, sometimes I find the colours quite garish, but again, I don't know if that's to do with like a backlighting or again, this idea of seeing images digitally that in painted form have a different quality of luminosity or not. I don't know. I mean, when you go and see them at MoMA,
it's funny. Years ago, probably 20 years ago now, 25 years ago, there was a big Rothko show at the National Gallery in DC. And when I say big, I mean 36 of them or more. Like, I mean, it was like dozens of those paintings from everywhere around the world, all brought to the same place, kind of thing. Yeah. And I found it interesting. One, I'm not a huge fan of those works. I find them a little disturbing or unsettling. Yeah. But what was interesting was when you had dozens of them next to each other, there was a sense, in my opinion, that some of them worked and some of them didn't. You could look at one combination of colors or fields and you go, yeah, I get that one. And then you go to the next one, you go, nope, you missed it on that one. I mean, it's all my opinion, but it's just, what was the distinction?
Yeah, no, I was going to ask, what is the requirement for success? This is something that I find fascinating with individuals, where we talk in a really opinioned way, you and I, about what we think work. We do sometimes have different barometer of success. Like, what do you call success in Rothko's paintings? Like, how do you determine which ones are successful or not?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's definitely sort of a gut feeling. And I just look at them and I think if I had, this is not actually what I'm thinking, but it's sort of, if I was the person painting them, if I would feel satisfied with the combination, like if I'd look at it and go, oh yeah, that's great. That one should stay as it is. I shouldn't change it. Or if I look at one and think, something about it's unfinished. And a lot of them felt unfinished. It's sort of like the colors that were chosen. It's like, yeah, okay, see where you're going, but it doesn't click into place like a Tetris puzzle. And some of them do. Some of them, and again, this is whatever, my silly opinion, but
no, it's not silly opinion, but it's also quite a difficult thing to get any purchase on if, you know, I'm not you and I don't see maybe what you see or not.
Yeah.
But I wonder if we can be a bit more attentive to like what our criteria is for looking at this kind of like, do you have an expectation about what you will see when you know
Well, I guess
you see a Rothko painting?
well, my question with that is that, yeah, okay, we can try to come up with objective measures of these things and put words to our feelings. In the end, though, is that going to change the way whether we sort of give it something thumbs up or thumbs down in our minds? And does it really matter why we do or do not like something?
No, I mean, this has been our point. I think both of us have made this point at different junctures throughout our throughout our career together.
Our journey together, yeah.
Is our opinion actually doesn't matter. What is of significance, though, is that you and I, as friends together, can look together at something where we may have a difference of opinion and talk about it, just look at it together. And I think that is the model, you know, maybe for viewers or listeners coming at this from my side of things, which you're probably students or thinking about writing a personal study for A-level or something. It's simply the fact that you and I are inquiring together. That's the model. It's like what we say actually is less important overall, apart from to you and I. Although, of course, I do think, and I find this myself, it is interesting listening to what others do think and feel about very famous artworks, because often it's so varied. And when there isn't a sense of receiving information, bold information, knowledge-based stuff, when someone's true intelligence comes through in their perception of something, that's what I find so fascinating. And also find it fascinating that we can be at once so different, but ultimately also all share a sense of something that may otherwise be nebulous. I don't know if that makes any sense, does it?
Yeah, I mean, like you're saying, ultimately it doesn't really matter what any of us think, but we can all have our own individual experience and opinions. And of course, looking at any piece of art can be greatly impacted by the experiences of the viewer, you know? So, I mean, while I think it's interesting to sort of come to terms with trying to explain using language why we feel a certain way, it's yeah, I do wonder whether it's like, well, okay, still it comes down to you like it or you don't like it, you know what I mean? Like you and I could try to convince you about some painting that you're very iffy about, or that Blur song that I texted you about the other day that you don't like, which I think is great. And you know, it's like, well,
terrible taste in music, Bill. Come on now.
Oh, I do not have terrible taste in music, but you know, but there is ultimately, you know, preferences are just such a strangely personal thing. Yeah. You know, I think a lot of times it's oftentimes the person themselves don't know why they like something, you know.
The world tells us that Rothko is a famous artist.
Right.
And there's a sense that we all scuttle off to look at his work, and together we ought to say, I like this because, and I don't like this because. And, you know, regardless of whether we like it or not, we are maybe expected to be respectful of its fame or its notoriety or whatever.
Sure.
But I do find sometimes with the big hitters we've ever talked about, Wyeth, Caravaggio, Rothko, people who really are established, people who have got, you know, like a legacy, an archive of work that is really well known and generally well regarded by the world, or certainly by the Western world.
Sure.
That nonetheless, there's still enough for us to really go into. So I don't think for a second that you and I could look at this red on maroon, and in a more kind of intellectual way, we may not actually say very much different than stuff that's already been said many other places at many other times.
Of course.
Nonetheless, I hope that we can still look at it together,
Sure.
and that we can work out a way through what we're seeing. So just to get the information part out the way, 1959 is within the period of Rothko's life that's considered like his classic period, his mature years of painting. He died in 1970. A lot of watchers will realise that he took his own life in 1970, age 66. This is a painting that was intended to hang in the Four Seasons restaurant in the Seagram building, which was designed by Mies van der Rohe. And the restaurant was designed by Philip Johnson. An interesting fact about that, actually, I do spend a lot of time talking about Johnson and Rothko and Mies van der Rohe at school with A-level 3D design students. Philip Johnson, and again, people may know this already, is one of the most, well-known American designers, very well connected, coming from enormous privilege, was a fascist.
Yeah.
Politically, he was far, far right. Rothko, a Latvian Jew, was kind of forced many times into collaborations with Johnson, which I find fascinating. I find it fascinating also that Mies van der Rohe, himself in so many ways, almost like a happy exile from Germany, would ever have put them together in the Seagram building. But later, when the commission was put together for what is called the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas, Philip Johnson was the original architect who was paired with Rothko again, and the relationship just fell apart. Now, Rothko withdrew his paintings, his murals, from the Seagram project, and he shipped them off to various galleries around the world instead. He gave them commission money back, everything. He just really found it quite an appalling thing that people would be sitting, these hugely wealthy, privileged people would be sitting around fine dining with his work on the walls, sort of oblivious maybe to some kind of suffering or trauma that could mean something global or external, or it could be within. I don't know in his case with Seagram whether it would have been about inner struggle or external turmoil, whatever that was. He fell apart with the Seagram project. He didn't want his paintings to go into that restaurant.
Do you ever think that, and I'm playing somewhat devil's advocate here, but that artists are overly self-important? You know what I mean? I mean, I don't like, in that story you just tell, it's like, okay, I understand that Mark Rothko wants his stuff shown in a place and in a way, and it's going to speak to certain people and give a certain message. Like, I understand all of that. Like, and I agree with that in a lot of ways, even with my own work. But at the same time, it's like somebody's paying you probably tens of thousands of dollars to paint the mural. Paint the GD mural. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not, it's, like it's not all about you. It's also about, the people who decided to build a restaurant. Does everyone who sits in that restaurant who may be thinking about other things, maybe their kid has cancer or something like that, and they're not worried about whatever you're trying to say with your painting. They're just,
hang on a second. Maybe I could get on board with this a little, but not for these. And the reason why it's not for these is that Rothko parceled these paintings up and he shipped them out to galleries. He wanted them to be seen and he wanted people to understand them. He just didn't want them to go there. And I think it's interesting when we look at sometimes paintings that end up on restaurant walls in the same way that we see Ansel Adams photographs that end up in doctor's surgeries framed, and they become like wallpaper. This
Sure.
is not
And
wallpaper.
Monet posters on college kids' walls. Yes.
You know, this, I'm sure people will disagree about this. This isn't wallpaper.
No.
Somebody wise is going to say, oh, it looks just like burgundy wallpaper I might buy at Farrow and Ball or something. No, this is the Seagram mural. This is one of many paintings in that series that are about probably anguish. I already said the word turmoil, but also some.
Yes. Yeah, but he did sign the contract in the first place, did he not?
He did, but I wonder, are we not allowed to change our minds? Are
Well,
we not
I guess
along a project and realize that actually it doesn't suit us?
right.
Again, thinking about my title today, Code Red, there are lots of things in Rothko's world that were warnings to him. And
Yeah.
more broadly, there's also a sense in his painting that there's some kind of warning.
Interestingly enough, though, isn't it? I find it interesting that he was established enough and successful enough that he could pull that relief valve without it completely tanking his career.
But don't forget, he wasn't. I mean, he was known in his lifetime.
Sure.
And he did pick up these extraordinary commissions. I mean, the Rothko
Right.
Chapel is just, wow.
Yeah.
But he lived, he had a very modest existence. He was not really, I think, maybe it was a lifestyle choice. He didn't live the high life. He didn't, or if he did, again, there was almost a sense of like personal restraint.
Yep.
In his world. But then also we look at this contextually in terms of where he grew up, how he grew up, who he came into contact with. I mean, his family migrated from Latvia, which was part of the wider Russia.
Sure.
Really tiny, I think a babe in arms. I think they went first of all to Portland, and maybe he on his own came as a teen to New York. He worked in a garment factory or something, I think. But he enrolled in Parsons. He came across Arshil Gorky, who he didn't like. He thought he was hugely prescriptive in the way that he taught painting. But he spent a lot of time with Avery, and he was also loosely associated with people who surrounded Avery at the time. And that, there was a loose collective of people like Barnett Newman, who we spoke about the other week, Gottlieb, and people who are, again, very well known 20th century considered to be American artists. Most of them somehow in exile or from what I think was like migrant families or immigrant families.
Sure.
All kind of coming at this like a new world order in painting through abstract expressionism and then ultimately color field.
Yeah.
What a fascinating time.
Sure. I mean, it's sort of, I mean, you can back up to the world wars and communism and fascism and how it shuffles the deck of humanity and who ended up where and who they bumped into because of that. It's sort of in a strange way, it's sort of an aftertaste of World War II. You know what I mean? That a lot of this kind of stuff happened. It's sort of the unintended consequences of things like that.
Well, I think definitely the Depression impacted
Sure.
what Rothko felt when he saw, and then how he then transposed what he saw into what he made. His early work to me is really fascinating because for a long time, I never, and sadly, I feel ashamed to say this, I didn't really look that much at his older work because I was so blindsided by, in my mind, the beauty and the power of his later work from his classic period. But
see, I mean, it's ironic that I connect more with this than I do the Fields, in the same way that I connect with Pollock's earlier stuff rather than the drip paintings.
Yeah,
it's like, so it's yeah. But I mean, maybe I'm just more representational than you, but yeah. Like, this is cool to me. Like, this would be cool if I saw it now, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree. It's that it's something also, though, that if we look at the evolution of a painter, and don't forget, you've asked now quite a few times for us to do this, where we look almost like an overview of one artist.
Yeah.
We have somebody who is still really, early on, he was concerned already with fields of color.
Yeah, it's ironic that it's basically the backdrop of this painting ends up becoming the foreground of his later paintings.
And the distance perception we have in paintings like this, where there is an element of representation, kind of gets messed with a bit. I mean, look at that ground layer. You've got the red and then the white. It's very bizarre, very there's something else going on with this, I think, that then is present, very much present later, which is more kind of like spiritual in some way. I don't know. I mean, it's just an untitled painting. Subway is the loose title it's been given as we've gone along in time. We've got these figures, we've got the columns, we've got the brick, we've got familiar things in this, and yet it's all at sea. It's all at sea.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you say that it's, I see what you're getting at. At the same time, to me, it also looks like and again, this is me putting myself in the mind of the person who made it, where if I was sitting here staring at this and I was working on something and I went, no, you know what? I'm giving the viewer too much information. I'm just going to fill all this stuff in with mustard. You know what I mean? Like that, I want to simplify this thing, and I'm going to do that with just a field of color in here. A color that in some ways like dominates the rest of it. And yet at the same time, it makes what is still there in representational even cooler and pop out a little bit. It's actually to me, it's a really neat effect, but I think of it almost as, I bet you that came, well, you know, I don't know, actually, I take that back. I was going to say that I bet you that came second, that he was painting a subway scene and then went, oh, no, hold on a second. And then started painting in the you know, I'd love to see this painting up close so I could see this, how it's layered. You know what I mean? Because doesn't it look like the orange is over the top of, it's like around the edges of the people. The people aren't painted on top of the orange. It's like the orange got brought in close to the edges of the people, you know?
Maybe. I mean, I read that though as a play with spatial reality.
Oh, I see. See, I see it as a purely just, I see it as a decision list and puts where the mustard came in the decision. I think it's later in the painting of the painting.
No, I do think this is like I think it's masterful with color. And I think, you know, title code red, I do want to talk about the red in this. The red in this is punctuating more even than those columns of jade.
Yeah, the guy with the little kid looks like he's on fire.
Yeah. There's something really otherworldly to me.
Doesn't it look like the kid needs to pee?
Well,
sorry, you're saying.
Maybe now you say it, Bill. That's what I'll see every time I see this painting.
I see something else in there that I'm not going to bring up too, but we can discuss that later.
Just do it. Just say it.
It's a little bit of a phallic thing going on with the guy behind the second column. But, you know, we're going to put that aside for now.
Oh, isn't it?
I like that he's showing this woman like in front of this kid. It's great.
What I want to know, and maybe this is like a normal thing on a New York subway, but what do you think is going on with that large white space held up? It looks to me like it's somebody holding something up. What is that? What is it? Is it
newspaper?
Is it newspaper?
Yeah, I imagine that as a newspaper.
Okay.
What did you see it as when you were?
Well, I did wonder if it was like holding up some kind of warning or like a,
Oh, I see. Like
or
that the view, like to the viewer
no,
or to themselves.
to the people.
Oh, no. Yeah, I see it as somebody who's like literally doing this, reading the newspaper. But I could be wrong. But that's what it definitely looks like to me. Because it also has these like little horizontal jotted lines, almost like it has writing on it. You know what I mean?
Hmm. I mean,
And it also seems like it has a fold down the middle. You see that?
yeah.
Yeah.
But again, that's spatial. That's a play on space, and I would imagine for Rothko that would have been deliberate. I mean, we look at the perspective in use in the what would be like a ceiling area. Apart from the fact that that then just goes to nothing. Like, why does the ceiling stop? Is this where the train track would be? In which case, why is somebody standing there? I mean, this is a painting that is just very strange. It's a very strange.
Do you see the mustard as nothingness or something else? Does it, I don't know if that any of those words mean anything.
I again, because I see this very much as somebody intelligently forcing our mind into a spatial reality that we don't easily understand or that we don't normally think about. I see the mustard as like it is the airspace, but that is something quite physical, maybe oppressive. Um,
It's so interesting the way you and I tend to look at things. To me, it's like you tend to assume the artist had a lot of meaning in every decision, where I generally assume that the artist had no meaning at all and they just thought it looked cool.
well,
The answer is probably somewhere in the middle or towards your end, but it's just interesting how you and I go about it from a different angle, you know. Mine is a very like practical angle and yours is a very cerebral angle.
I don't know if mine's cerebral. I suspect that where your creative output is photographic,
Yes.
like mine is obviously photographic as well, but I do paint, and that physical relationship with paint is quite an unusual one for a thoughtful person. I mean, it's kind of instinctive. I speak to a lot of painters, and the application of paint is instinctive. There's a sense of just knowing. I wonder why, then going back to your point about this is like and correct me if this is not what you meant, but that the mustard is just like a fill-in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean it like that flippantly, but I just think that it was he either had something underneath it, or he felt like if he added more detail behind the people, it would lose something. And so he kind of said, "Oh, I've got these teals and these grays and these pinks. Like, what would be the inverse of that I can like play with and just kind of slam people?" And maybe, to your point, maybe he's always had this idea of just these fields of color in his mind, and this is just sort of the beginning of that. But I definitely don't think of it as, I don't look at this and think, oh, he had a field of mustard and then painted Subway in front of it. I see it as he painted the Subway and then said, ooh, it'd be really interesting if there was a whole lot of mustard in here. It's definitely that way in my mind. And that's just my, you know, my feeling based upon, you know, years of making stuff in the process my brain goes through when trying to make something. Could be totally wrong, and maybe I'm just terrible at making stuff, but it could, you know, anyway, it's just fun.
Can we see Rothko as we know him from his classic period in this, though?
If you had showed me this painting, I don't know that I would have made the direct connection. I would have said that mustard color looks like something that belongs in the 60s or 70s. But I've never seen this work before. And so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
I would also like to say that it is masterful use of color.
Yeah.
In a way that allows color to balance so perfectly, which I love. I think it's entering a color space, whether or not it's an intention color field painting from slightly later in modern art history. Color allows us to enter the space. This mustard, though it might be like, as I said, oppressive or an intentionally oppressive presence to us, the people in the painting, I suppose if we could imagine them as part of a story, because this is a narrative painting, they're not aware of the mustard yellow, of the ochre.
Yeah. Although it's interesting because I don't see it as an oppressive color. I mean, now this is like an archaeopteryx of painting right here. Like a weird transitional thing of like, oh.
Wow. I mean, this is from his transitional period.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, it's like you look at this and you go, I don't think he had any idea what direction he was going to end up in the end.
No, but he was very interested always in, if not the occult, then certainly the spiritual. He was very interested in symbols and mythologies. I think Rothko was quite other.
Yeah.
Smart. Really smart. Which I like anyway in humans generally. This sort of smartness, this ability to take things that are ancient and universal and work with them in a way that, I guess, enhances them through visual beauty.
It's interesting. Isn't it interesting though, that like in this piece, even though you have this sort of trifold kind of feel, right? That the colors in it are incredibly muted and pastel-y and just, like not at all what you would put if I just said Rothko to you. These are not the colors you would make a color sample out of, No,
and in context of it being code red for us tonight, I put this one in here because this is right in the middle of what is considered his transitional period. And I think this is also the year when he met his second wife, or he married his second wife. And I do wonder if maybe for a brief period, I don't want to say he was maybe happy, but that he wasn't dogged by the same darkness or darknesses that otherwise permeated the entirety of his life. And the title, Hierarchical Birds, that's a story. It's a storytelling title, and it's also a leading title in terms of its own, the language is symbol. Hierarchical birds. I wonder what he was reading at the time. I wonder what texts he was looking at. He was like many people, again, sort of an explosion of culture. The 20th century is so rich for collision of culture,
but it's also this weird hodgepodge of symbolism in here, right? I mean, it's not particularly cohesive.
Why do you say that?
I mean, there's it feels like mythic elements from 17 different cultures going on here.
Well, don't most people in the West cherry pick their cultural references?
Sure, but cherry pick or what is the difference between cherry picking and having some sort of Chinese symbol that you think means something and actually means something completely different? And where it's just like is there cherry picking and then there's sort of cluelessness about what things mean, or rather that it all just becomes emojis that people can snap together, you know what I mean, even though they're taken out of 12 different cultures. I mean, obviously lots of ancient cultures had things about birds and feathers and eyes and all these different shapes and things. It's weirdly a little Egyptian, but it's also a little Mesoamerican, and I mean, there's lots of all that stuff in there.
Well, he was, again, this is all stuff that he was really into. He was like
Right.
embedded in this thinking at this time, and this transitional period was kind of guided by that interest. He would have been aware and would have been widely read on ancient cultures, Mesoamerican. He was, like, again, his contemporaries, an interest in what we think of as Far East or Buddhist, Zen, kind of ideas, philosophies. And again,
but isn't it interesting that all those ideas and philosophies, despite being of the same, not even the same era, but all of them are really old, but they're all over the world, and you're mixing and matching them like they're, crayons, you're all right with that? You like that idea, or do you think that's a very sort of, it feels to me like a very, not Western privilege, but just like sort of weirdly colonial kind of way of looking at things?
Well, as I
you
said,
can disagree. Yeah.
No, I don't disagree. I think in the West, the fact is that this happens.
True.
Right.
I guess what I'm saying is that I don't necessarily believe that it's good. You know what I mean? Just because it does happen. I'm not saying that you do. It's weird to me when I look at stuff like this and I'm like, what were these people thinking in the mid 20th century?
I suspect what they were thinking, in all honesty, is they weren't thinking in the context we think in now, where we have much wider awareness of kind of morality and ethics of cultural appropriation. Like, we give a shit more now, one would hope. I don't think we're through the side of badness. I don't think that, but we are becoming more aware as we go forward through time of what is actually okay, what has not been okay from the past to do that we ought not to do still now. But in this 20th century point in our art history, our cultural history in the West, and especially in the US, bearing in mind that the people who are making paintings like this, who've kind of come out through the annals of time to still be well known and regarded now, these people would actually have been genuinely interested in a wide canvas of ideas that were not brand new in the scheme of actual history, but that were for once coming to maybe more of a forefront of cultural awareness.
Sure, but probably largely because they were novel or occultish, you know what I mean, in that way, right? Like that they were something different and mysterious and therefore interesting.
But does everybody find things that are mysterious interesting? I find mysterious things interesting.
I do, and by the way, I would like to go down on record in saying that I don't think that people using symbols from other cultures is necessarily a bad thing. I don't mean it in that way. I think that the history of humanity is built around people sharing ideas and whatever. So I'm fine with that for the most part. But I just think that this to me just feels like it feels like a mid 20th century painting version of Gaudi architecture, which is just like, you just couldn't decide on an idea, so you just threw it all at the wall, and who knows what's there at the end.
I'm sure we've got lots of Gaudi lovers watching who would really
Oh,
balk
I know.
what you just said.
I know. My friend Jonathan was just in Barcelona to go on a big Gaudi tour, and I was just like, yeah, that stuff feels like a Dr. Seuss, bad trip to me. But and that's not to say somebody else can't like it. Whatever, everyone can like what they like. But I just look at it and I just think, I don't think that he even knew what he was doing at this time.
Well, hang
I
on.
think he was throwing spaghetti at the wall, trying to find something that turned him on. Go ahead, sorry.
At this time he was prolifically writing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
Later on in the late 40s, he wrote an essay. What was it called? The Romantics were prompted, I think. It was 1948 that was published. Anyway, he said at that time that the archaic artist found it necessary to create a group of intermediaries, monsters, hybrids, gods, and demigods, in much the same way that modern man found intermediaries in fascism and the Communist Party. But it goes on to say that for Rothko, he's quoted as saying that without monsters and gods, art cannot enact a drama. Now, Rothko's work is really dramatic.
Yeah.
Isn't it? In all ways, actually, there's a drama in his work. So especially, I would say, in his later works, his classic work, in his mature years, his work becomes so powerful, so far-reaching, that
existential.
We're looking at somebody who's creating something that conveys back to an audience a primal power. Now, at this point in the transitional period of his career, he was still developing his language and the codification of the world for him as it would become. Now, I don't hold it against Rothko that he went from this to this, and then later, much later, to something like this, or indeed the one of the Seagram murals that we saw right at the start.
Sure.
All of this is actually part of the same language of somebody in this struggle for, I think, if not enlightenment, then certainly, maybe it is enlightenment.
I understand what you're saying. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying, in that transition period, let's say he never got here, I don't think he would have felt like he had been successful in saying what he wanted to say. I think when artists are pulling in the symbols and language of other peoples and things in order to try to figure out who they are, they're fishing because they don't know who they are and what direction they're going in. And I think eventually he found that thing not too long after all of that stuff. And I think if you had asked him in 1969 whether the stuff he was making in the mid 40s was where he wanted to be, he would say, "Oh God, no, that was a dead end, or that was I was in at sea and lost at sea, and I finally figured it out at some point in 1958 or whatever it is." And that I don't know. There's this. Again, this is a lot of this is like an autobiographical interpretation, totally. But it's like sometimes I can see things that people make and I can say, you don't even really believe in this. Like you're saying this, you're saying that, but like I can tell your heart's not in it. That like you don't have it yet. You're not there. You're not happy with this. And if you put a couple drinks in them and had them sitting on a couch at 3 a.m., they would probably say, shoot, you're right. You're right. It's like, it's not there. And I could be totally wrong, but like, this is just, I just find it interesting. Sorry, go ahead. I cut you off. Am I making no sense?
You're making sense. I would have to say that I there's a little bit of resistance in me to what you're saying.
Okay.
That's really coming up for me in this. You know, I'm looking at something where I am going to assume that the artist, in this case Rothko, is grappling with the world.
Yeah.
And I would say that he's grappling with the world in this painting. It's just the form has become altered somehow.
No,
As
see,
far
I
as
see it as,
we receive it, but what I would really like to say that from my point of view, the journey of an artist, every single thing that an artist does is of vital importance.
of course, in the same way that Paul McCartney thinks every album he does is his best album. But I will tell you that there are times in Paul McCartney's career when he's made a record and said, "Oh yeah, that one is Sgt. Pepper," and then the other one is, you know, whatever the, I don't know. Let's see. Tug of War is a good record, but you get Pipes of Peace maybe. But you get my point, is that I think that you're right. It's all a struggle against this thing. But I think in this case, in these later works, Mark Rothko, yes, is struggling, but at this point, he's got, you know, his arms around the hands around the neck of the demon. The demon is not running him around the ring.
But this,
it's like a different.
this is the point we were looking at a little bit earlier, where this is about what the expectation is that makes Rothko's work good. I could look at this painting and say, right, this is a painting by Mark Rothko. And yes, my mind is clouded with what I know came next, because I'm looking backwards.
Yep.
But I would assume that were I moving in tandem with Rothko through the journey, that this would seem highly relevant to his progress.
Sure.
And you know, this one is maybe more obvious for us to speak to about that evolution from somebody working with you know, spatial realities and color fields. You know, that makes sense, doesn't it, to reach this or indeed that.
Sure. But
And
what I'm saying is that if he never got to the color field work, you would never even have seen Hierarchical Birds. He would be an artist that no one thought about anymore. And this is the thing that I always find fascinating about artists and musicians and all these people who are famous for very specific things, who then their entire catalog of work is remembered now. But really, none of it would be remembered if it wasn't for this 5-year period where they made this album or painted these paintings or wrote this poem or wrote this one book, you know. And the question is, does it make this painting good? Or is it just that this painting is interesting in context of where he got to when he did get in a way that's considered by society to be important? You know, do we look back on this and give it importance it wouldn't have on its own, only because it's in a timeline, is my question.
it is in a timeline, and inevitably that's how we must view it, because you and I are now, and Rothko is many years dead, and we can only look backwards, can't we?
Right.
But what I would say is that I don't think that had he stopped or stayed with this way of working for longer, that he would have fallen into obscurity. I mean, we see this through, you know, I'm not going to say that, of course, Mark Rothko would always have been famous, because that is an unknown. That is something that, you know, even for my levels of supposition, is far too far. But what I would say is there's no reason to think that this kind of work isn't still relevant. I mean, we see through artists like Max Ernst with Lop Lop, for example,
Yep.
that this kind of symbolism, this kind of symbolic work, there was a massive kind of appetite for this work. Don't forget that at the point of making these kinds of paintings, I'm not going to say he was meeting a demand, but there was kind of like a paradigmatic
Yeah.
shift culturally.
It was the direction the zeitgeist was going, and he was following along.
And I don't know if he was following along. This is something I also really want to take issue with, Bill, because I feel you can see me. I think I am quite resistant to what you're saying.
I can see it.
It's because I feel massively protective of Rothko.
Why?
Because much as he is so widely studied, spoken about, written about, intellectualized, the way I see him is I do see him as part of this extremely important movement in art, and that he himself was his own movement. And through this work, whether it's from 1920s when he was making kind of rudimentary, bulky figure forms, kind of like a cross between something that Max Ernst would have painted in Picasso. We see an emergence of an artist who really does have not just visual art at his fingertips, but vision. He was visionary. Now,
and I don't mean to take anything away from any of that. I tend not to put very few people up on pedestals, and even them I'm trying to knock off of pedestals, because I also like the idea of thinking that like he was just some guy named Mark.
He was.
Who did not have some plan for his entire career. He was just going day by day trying to figure it out. And where he ended up is probably not where he ever planned to end up. And he was always just searching for it. And I like that sort of narrative, because it feels like that is ultimately what all of our lives are.
I would also just like to say that unlike, I'm not going to say his nemesis, but unlike Philip Johnson, who came from enormous privilege, Rothko did not.
Yep.
And at this period of history, to be brave enough to be an artist who didn't come from privilege, but who was compelled to make art, what more could we ask of anyone who chooses to share with us the deepest expression? Again, back to my generosity point about artists. Rothko to me is a true artist. He's not coming at this from an agenda of privilege or an agenda of, well, maybe there was an element of political agenda in the wider context of what he was doing. But, his family were really concerned about him becoming an artist because it wasn't seen as a proper paid profession. But he took the risk because he was compelled to paint. And he was compelled to paint because there was something about what happened between his spirit and that canvas that pushed him on, that spurred him on, that brought a new reality. And so I feel very respectful of Rothko.
It's funny. I think you and I are both respectful of Rothko. I just see my respect not coming from reverence, but from a belief that he was searching in the way that we're all searching, and I find beauty in that. By the way, did I ever tell you the story about the time I spent at the Glass House?
Tell me.
I was once hired by, well, long story, but a friend of mine who was working with the Glass House people, and they asked me to go photograph 360-degree fields for this website. And so this was like not long after he died, and I ended up alone.
Oh yeah,
because I couldn't have any. Yeah, and it was just like, here I am in the dude's bedroom alone, and they never let anybody alone in these places, and I'm like, this is just kind of surreal. It was pretty cool. Anyway, yeah.
It doesn't come close to that, but I did get the last ticket to go and see Picassos Chateau at Vavenard in Provence. Yeah. And it was very kind of closely guarded maybe is too strong a word, but it was almost as if you were entering like a secret realm, being allowed up there.
Sure.
The minibus up to the chateau, and it was very small, a very small group, and it was the last one before it would be shut up and nobody would be allowed to come back in. And I think there were 12 of us, and I lingered longer than I should have or was allowed to in the bathroom, actually.
Oh, interesting.
And it was just so surreal to be in to be in this place where, you know, like the titan of 20th century art would once have sat enthroned for a shit. Seemed quite, yeah, surreal, but
Yeah,
also there's something quite humbling about it. And I do
of
find this
course.
when I go
And
to,
that's exactly my point, by the way. That's what I'm talking about. Like, it's just like, they're just people, but go ahead.
no, they are just people, but well, there's no but to that. This is the thing that is so vital, isn't it? That we're sharing as people. We're expressing something and putting it out into the world for others to see and potentially feel. You know, this is Rothko's last painting. This was in his studio. He was found on the floor. There's that dreadful anecdote about him being found having shot himself in a pool of red blood, obviously, that was remarkably similar in many ways to his painting. The size of it, the pool of blood. I mean, what a kind of ghastly anecdote to share, but it is something that is kind of widely known. And on the, I don't know if this was on the floor or if it was on the wall, but you know, this watches over him. I could take this too far as a story that I don't
Sure.
really know, so I'm not going to go there. But things that, again, that I would tell myself or ask myself about this painting. And again, back to our title for tonight, Code Red, what warnings there are in painting, what generosities there are the things that make them so endlessly interesting to me. And
Well, warnings there are toward to the artists themselves, I guess, to some extent.
yeah, you know, when we're really faced with something that we have created ourselves, and we're in that mirror zone of seeing our output, the output that has come, in Rothko's case, I will imagine, from a very sensitive, incredibly intense, thoughtful person, to externalize that which is within, and for the externalization to be made manifest like this is, you know, maybe he didn't care about the warning. Maybe it was just a fait accompli.
Yeah, maybe this was the last thing he wanted to say. It wasn't about, you know.
And notice that the red has become a living red, a vivid red. Not the red of old blood, of fresh blood. Not of something
Yes, true.
past,
Yeah.
something visceral, real, present. And so we've come on this journey, you and I, through Rothko's painting to land up here. And I do wind up in his studio, and I imagine it like a bird hovering above him looking at it, which might sound gruesome and macabre, but I feel very grateful to Rothko. And I'm not sure that it's because I put him on a pedestal, and you use the word reverence, maybe I have as well, but really it's also just about sharing in something with someone.
Sure. Do you also tend to find that you artists that you somehow identify with personally, or you imagine you could be them? Not that you were that artist, but like, oh, this person could have been my friend, or I could imagine being what I imagined was going on in their head goes on in my head. Therefore, you identify with them in a way. Is that a thing?
Of course. It's about how.
Do you think that's the case with Rothko in some way? Specifically? Feel free not to answer this. I'm just wondering.
The answer comes back to the Rothko room at Tate Modern. Because when I go into that room, when I enter that space with those paintings, which are vast, the room has a quality of timelessness and of like a spatiality that is formless, mystical.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I identify with it, I wonder about this sort of philosophically. Is there actually anything external for me? So what I mean is that, of course, I'm looking, it's out there, but the identification isn't with Rothko. He's helping me identify something within myself.
Yeah. It's the other way around. See, Mark Rothko.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Sandi.